All right, so, for centuries, philosophers have been kind of obsessed with these "what is X" questions.
Yeah,
So it
absolutely.
goes all the way back, like, to Socrates and even before.
Hmm.
But it just struck me in prepping for our deep dive today that the very act of trying to answer these questions, like the whole process of definition itself, that's like a philosophical rabbit hole in its own right.
It really is.
And you sent over some fascinating material from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this whole topic of definition.
Right.
And one thing became super clear right off the bat.
Hmm.
Defining our terms, well, it's a lot more complicated than just, grabbing a dictionary.
Oh, yeah. It's way more to it than that. It gets pretty complex.
Yeah. So for all of you out there who love to really get into the nuts and bolts of philosophical ideas, consider this deep dive like a master class in that essential philosophical tool definition.
I like that.
We're going to break down all the different kinds of definitions that philosophers have come up with, from
Hmm.
the super practical ways we use language every day
Hmm.
to some pretty out there theoretical stuff.
Yeah, the whole spectrum.
Yeah. And we're also going to dig into the logical standards, the criteria that we use to judge whether a definition is even any good.
Like, how do we even know if we're doing it right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what makes a definition work? It's like people.
I like that analogy a lot, actually.
Yeah, yeah. So, mission accomplished today. If we walk away with a clearer, even more refined understanding of this whole definition game, which is like essential to doing philosophy at all, really.
Sure.
All right, so let's dive right in. The encyclopedia starts off by making this distinction between real and nominal definitions. And this goes all the way back to John Locke, right?
That's right.
So can you unpack that for us a bit? What's the core difference there?
Sure. Locke, he basically said that a nominal essence is just the abstract idea that we connect with a particular name, as language users. So
Mm-hmm.
let's say the term water. The nominal essence might be, well, it's clear, it's drinkable, you find it in lakes and rivers.
Right, right. The everyday stuff.
Exactly. But the real essence, well, that's the underlying structure of the thing itself, like the stuff we might not even be able to perceive directly. So for water, that would be its molecular structure, H2O.
Oh, okay. So that's what makes it have all those properties we associate with it.
Right. So a nominal definition basically tries to capture that everyday understanding, how we usually think about and use the word. While a real definition, it's going after that deep down essence of what the thing actually is.
I'm with you. So when a lexicographer is putting together a dictionary entry, they're mostly focused on that nominal definition, right? Like explaining how people generally use the word.
Exactly.
But when a chemist says water is H2O, they're giving us a real definition,
Right.
right?
Yeah, they're going deeper into the structure of it.
Exactly.
But the thing is, and the encyclopedia makes this point, the line between those two, it can get a bit blurry.
Oh, how so?
Well, let's say a biologist defines whale. They might say it's a large marine mammal that breathes air and nurses its young.
Okay. Sounds reasonable.
Right. So that feels like it's referring to the actual animal itself, right?
It does, yeah.
So in a sense, it is a real definition, but it doesn't necessarily spell out like all the genetic details, the physiology, the stuff that really makes a whale in the absolute deepest sense.
So it's real, but it's not totally complete.
Yeah, it might not be getting at all of what Locke called the insensible parts.
I see, I see. And that it actually gets to a pretty fundamental debate in philosophy, right? Like
Hmm.
whether we can even know the true essence of things or if it's like just a product of how we use language.
Huge question, yeah. And this seemingly simple distinction between real and nominal definitions, it's been fueling those debates for centuries.
Wow. Okay, so how about this then? When Socrates was going around asking what is justice or what is piety,
Yeah.
where does that fit into this whole real versus nominal framework?
That is the million-dollar question. So let's say Socrates is, he's mainly trying to figure out how his fellow Athenians are using those words. Like, what are their shared understandings and moral intuitions about justice, piety, all that.
Okay, so he's after the common ground in their language.
Exactly. And in that case, His search could be seen as trying to get at a really solid, robust nominal definition.
But what if he's after something more?
Right, because some philosophical traditions, they argue that there are these objective, like capital T truth ideals of justice and piety.
That exist out there regardless of how we happen to talk about them.
Exactly. And if that's what Socrates is after, then he's looking for a real definition. Like he's trying to grasp the true fundamental essence of justice itself.
So it all depends on what kind of philosopher Socrates is, right?
Yeah. His whole philosophical project, his assumptions about what we can even know, it's all wrapped up in how we interpret his questions.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk dictionary definitions. We all use them, but what do philosophers have to say about their role, their limitations, all that?
So the encyclopedia lays it out pretty clearly. The main point of a dictionary definition is it's a practical thing.
Right, it's about helping us use language.
Exactly. It gives us enough of an understanding of a word so we can, function in everyday life, comprehend sentences, use the word correctly, all that. I mean, when you think about it, a good dictionary entry it's a pretty incredible feat.
It really is. So much information packed into such a concise form.
Right. It unlocks this whole universe of possible sentences for us.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But the text also points out that when philosophers are working on definitions, they're often going for something more than what a dictionary gives us.
Yeah, much.
So how do they differ? Like, what are they aiming at that's different?
Well, think about someone like Frege, who was, trying to define number in purely logical terms, or Tarski, who wanted to define truth in a completely rigorous way.
Those are some pretty ambitious projects.
Right. And those weren't meant to just be like replacements for dictionary entries. They had these big, sweeping philosophical goals.
Like Frege was trying to build math up from logic, right? And Tarski, he was trying to understand the very nature of what it means for something to be true. Huge stuff.
Exactly. And those kinds of philosophical definitions, they have these far-reaching theoretical implications that go way beyond just, describing how a word is commonly used.
So they're doing a different kind of work.
Yeah, a different kind of work altogether.
Okay, got it. All right, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about stipulative definitions.
Okay, yeah.
Now, this kind of sounds like we're just making stuff up as we go along, right?
Well, in a way, that's kind of what's happening. With a stipulative definition, you're basically saying, okay, this word is going to mean this, and it doesn't have to line up with how people were using the word before.
So I could just say, I don't know, from now on, glebe means a three-legged purple elephant that loves classical music.
Exactly. You're just assigning a specific meaning to the word. And what's really interesting for philosophers is what happens after that. Because once you've made that stipulation, the statement, glebes have three legs, that becomes necessarily true. It's certain, and you know it just by virtue of how you define the word.
So it's like we're creating truth by definition. That feels a little bit like a cheat. Like, couldn't you just define anything to be true then?
Yeah, and that's a good point. It highlights why purely stipulative definitions can be tricky. But they do have a really important role. Like, think about all the technical terms in science and math.
Right.
They often get introduced this way through stipulations.
Makes sense.
Now, the encyclopedia gets into some really interesting territory with stipulative definitions when it brings in Kripke's ideas about reference-fixing stipulations.
Yeah, like defining Jack the Ripper as the person who committed those murders in Whitechapel. So how's that different from our glebe example?
Okay, so Kripke, he argued that in cases like Jack the Ripper, the description, that whole phrase, the person who committed those murders, it's primarily there to fix the reference of the name. Like, it tells us who the name Jack the Ripper is actually pointing to.
Okay.
But the name itself, it's not synonymous with the description, if you get what I mean.
I think so.
Like, it's a contingent fact that someone committed those murders, and that the guy we've named Jack the Ripper is that guy. So the statement Jack the Ripper is the person who committed those murders. Well, that could have been false.
Right. Someone else could have done it.
Exactly. But the statement Jack the Ripper is Jack the Ripper, well, that's a necessary truth. And this is how Kripke gets to his famous argument for contingent a priori truths.
Oh, right, because we fix the reference a priori, through that description.
Yeah.
But the actual identity we're establishing, that's a contingent matter of fact.
Right. So it's like it challenges this whole traditional view of what's necessary and what we can know a priori. It's pretty radical stuff.
Yeah, it really makes you think. All right, let's shift gears again. Let's talk descriptive definitions. This is where we're trying to capture how a word is already being used, right?
Exactly. Like when philosophers are trying to define knowledge or freedom or justice,
Mm.
getting back to Socrates for a moment, they usually want to come up with a definition that's descriptively adequate.
Right.
Yeah.
It can't just be some totally made-up thing that has nothing to do with how people actually use the word.
Exactly. If it clashes too much with our actual language and thought, well, then it's probably not a very good definition.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, the encyclopedia breaks down descriptive adequacy into 3 different levels: extensional, intentional, and sense adequacy.
Okay, let's take those one at a time. So, extensional adequacy. That's all about whether the definition correctly picks out all the actual things in the world that the word refers to, right?
Yeah, like no counterexamples.
So, for example, the first president of the United States, that's extensionally adequate as a definition of George Washington.
Exactly. It perfectly captures the scope of the term.
Okay, got it. So what about intentional adequacy?
Okay, so this one goes beyond just the actual world. It takes into account all the possible ways things could be, all the possible worlds, as philosophers like to say. So the definition has to hold up even in hypothetical situations.
Okay, so it's like it can't just be true by accident, right? It has to be true in every possible scenario.
The classic example here is water is H2O.
Right, right.
So following Kripke and Putnam, the idea is that the identity between water and H2O is a necessary truth.
It holds in every possible world where water exists.
Exactly. So that definition, it's both intentionally and extensionally adequate.
Okay, so what's sense adequacy then? I mean, if water is H2O is both extensionally and intentionally adequate, why do we need another level?
Because the sense of a term, like the way we actually think about it, it can be different from its physical or chemical makeup or its extension and intention.
Huh.
Like people knew what water was for thousands of years before they had any clue about H2O.
That's true.
Right. The meaning we attach to the word, the way it fits into our understanding of the world, it's distinct from just knowing its chemical formula.
Interesting.
And the encyclopedia points out that for a lot of philosophical problems, especially in areas like epistemology and philosophy of mind, getting the extension and the intention right, well, it's often not enough.
You need to capture that sense. That way we actually think about the concept.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So we're not just concerned with what a term refers to, but also with how it functions in our minds and our thinking.
You got it.
All right, so let's tackle explicative definitions now. This is a concept that's often connected with Carnap, right?
Yeah, it's very much a Carnapian idea.
Okay, so what's the thinking behind explicative definitions?
Well, think of it like this. You've got this concept that's maybe a bit fuzzy, a bit imprecise.
Okay.
Explication is like trying to sharpen it up. You want to keep the core of the concept intact, the parts that are clear, but then you want to make the less clear parts, the edges, more precise, more rigorous.
So it's like refining the concept.
Exactly. You're trying to make it more useful, more powerful for doing philosophy.
Okay, and what's an example of this in action?
The classic one is the set theoretic definition of an ordered pair.
Right, right. The whole Langle X, Y wrangle equals Y business.
That's the one. So with an ordered pair, like the key thing is that the order matters, right?
Right. Langle X, Y wrangle is not the same as Langle Y, actually.
In fact, X and Y are the same thing. Right. And the set theoretic definition, it captures that perfectly. 2 ordered pairs are identical if and only if their components are identical in the same order.
Okay, so that's the essence of the concept, right? That the order is part of what makes it what it is.
Precisely. But now the interesting thing is, this definition, it might lead to some weird consequences. Things that don't quite line up with how we normally think about ordered pairs.
Like what?
Well, for example, X becomes a member of the pair, Langle X, Y wrangle.
Okay.
And that's not something that's like immediately obvious from our everyday understanding of ordered pairs.
Right, right.
But Carnap and Quine, they argued that those kinds of mismatches, they're okay as long as the core function of the concept is preserved. Like as long as the explication makes the concept more useful for doing theoretical work. And in this case, it gives us a really nice foundation for talking about relations and functions within set theory.
So as long as it does the job we need it to do, we can live with a little bit of weirdness.
Yeah. And it's a trade-off we see a lot in philosophy, especially when we're trying to formalize things, to make them really precise.
Yeah, it's like you're giving up a bit of of intuitive clarity in exchange for logical rigor.
Exactly.
And the encyclopedia also mentions the truth functional conditional as
Yeah.
another example of explication, right?
Yes. So the material conditional in logic, it has these well-known paradoxical implications, right? It doesn't quite match up perfectly with how we use if then in everyday language.
Right, right.
But for the purposes of building these formal logical systems and analyzing arguments, the material conditional it's really powerful. It simplifies the logic, even if it doesn't, perfectly capture all the nuances of how we reason with conditionals in everyday life.
So again, it's that trade-off.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to ostensive definitions.
Yeah.
This is the classic point and name kind of definition, right?
Exactly. It's all about directly interacting with the world. So think about pointing at a red object and saying, "This is red." Or, pointing at your dog and saying, "This is Fido."
Simple enough.
Seemingly simple, but there's a lot going on philosophically. The encyclopedia really emphasizes how this kind of direct engagement with the world, it can fix the reference of a term even when a description might be ambiguous.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow that.
Well, imagine you're trying to define dog just by describing it. You might say, it's a furry, four-legged animal. But that could refer to, all sorts of things. Cats, wolves, foxes, whatever.
Right. But if I point at my dog and say dog, there's no ambiguity.
Aye, correct.
Everyone knows what I'm talking about.
Exactly. Your visual attention, the shared environment, it all helps to narrow down the possibilities.
The context does a lot of the work.
It really does. And this is where it gets really interesting for philosophy. Ostensive definitions, they can actually add something new to our language. Like if there wasn't a word for that specific shade of blue, I could just point at it and make up a word for it.
Right.
And that raises this question of whether those kinds of ostensively defined terms can always be eliminated. Like, can you always find a purely descriptive way to capture that same meaning?
Yeah. Is there always a way to say it without pointing?
Exactly.
And the encyclopedia even mentions that some philosophers like Russell and Whiteley, they saw ostensive definitions as the bedrock of all our concepts.
Yeah, the idea is that ultimately all our concepts, all our knowledge, it comes back to these direct sensory encounters with the world.
But didn't Wittgenstein kind of push back against that?
He did. In his later work, he argued that even ostensive definitions, they're way more complex than we might think. The meaning of even those seemingly simple point and name terms, it's all wrapped up in our practices, our forms of life. Like it's not just about the pointing itself.
Okay, so it's about the whole context, the
Yeah.
whole web of meanings that we bring to it.
Exactly. And one more thing I want to highlight is that all these categories of definition, they're not always mutually exclusive,
Right. It's not like they're all in these neat little boxes.
Yeah, no. Like a stipulative definition could accidentally turn out to be extensionally adequate. And dictionaries, they use pictures all the time, right?
Yeah.
So that's a form of ostension. And you can even use ostension to clarify a concept that was already there.
To explicate it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a pretty messy business, this whole definition game.
Okay, so we talked about all these different kinds of definitions. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty, the logic of definitions.
Okay, yeah, let's get logical.
The encyclopedia outlines kind of three main ideas of the traditional account.
Mm-hmm.
Definitions is generalized identities,
Mm-hmm.
the primacy of the sentential,
Yeah.
and this idea of reduction.
Okay.
So can you walk us through those?
Sure. So the first one, the idea of definitions as generalized identities. That basically means that at its core, a definition establishes an equivalence between the term being defined, the definendum,
Right.
and the expression that defines it, the definiens. And this equivalence, it's what allows us to do all that substitution stuff in logic.
Right. So if I define widower as a man whose wife has died, then I could just swap those phrases around in any sentence.
Exactly. Wherever the definendum shows up, you can replace it with the definiens and vice versa.
Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. What about this primacy of the sentential?
So this idea emphasizes that words, they don't just float around in isolation, right? They get their meaning from how they're used in sentences.
Yeah.
So if you want to understand what a word means, you've got to look at how it's functioning in those sentential contexts.
Okay, so the sentence is king, basically.
Yeah. And that's why the traditional view says explaining the meaning of a word, it's all about analyzing how it behaves in the sentences it appears in.
Makes sense. All right, then there's reduction. So this is the idea that we should be able to explain any formula with a defined term in it, we should be able to break it down into an equivalent formula that only uses the original vocabulary, the ground language.
Right. We should be able to get rid of the defined term completely.
Okay, and this leads to this criterion of eliminability, right?
Exactly. The idea is that a good definition should let us eliminate the defined term entirely. Like, swap it out for a bunch of words from the ground language that mean the same thing. And this is seen as a sign that the definition is non-circular and genuinely explanatory.
Okay, so it's like you're showing that the defined term wasn't really adding anything new to the language, right?
Yeah, it was just a kind of shorthand, a convenient way of saying something we could already say.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, when it comes to stipulative definitions specifically, the encyclopedia highlights two really important criteria: conservativeness and use.
Right, right. And how do those relate to eliminability? Like, are they kind of different sides of the same coin?
Well, conservativeness, it's this principle that a stipulative definition, it shouldn't let you prove any new stuff about the ground language, like stuff you couldn't have proven before you introduced the definition.
So you're not sneaking in new knowledge through the back door, so to speak.
Exactly.
The definition is just about words, not about facts about the world.
Right. And use just means that the definition, it actually does what it's supposed to do. It fixes the meaning of the new term.
It tells us how to use the word.
Yeah. And eliminability, you can think of it as a really strong way of ensuring both conservativeness and use. Because if you can always eliminate the defined term, swap it out for the ground language stuff, well, you haven't actually added any new knowledge about the world.
So that takes care of conservativeness.
Right. And the definition itself, it tells you how to do that elimination. So it's also fixing the use of the new term.
Okay, now the encyclopedia gets into all these syntactic and semantic formulations of these criteria. Do we need to go into the hardcore logic here, or can we keep it high level?
Yeah, we can keep it conceptual, I think.
Okay, good.
So the syntactic formulations, they're all about provability. Like, can you derive a new theorem using this definition?
Okay.
And the semantic formulations, they're about truth and validity. Like, does the definition change what's true or valid in the ground language?
So it's like two different ways of looking at the same basic question.
Exactly. And eliminability, you can also formulate that syntactically and semantically. Like, can you prove that every formula with the defined term is equivalent to one without it, or are they just semantically equivalent?
Okay.
So yeah, it's philosophers being very careful, making sure they've covered all their bases.
Right. Right. And one thing that's really important to remember is that whether a definition meets these criteria, it all depends on what your ground language is.
Absolutely. A definition that's perfectly fine in one context, it could be a total disaster in another.
So context matters.
Context is everything.
All right, so let's talk about definitions in normal form. The encyclopedia says that if a definition meets conservativeness and eliminability, you can often show that it's equivalent to one in normal form.
Right.
So
yeah.
what does a definition in normal form actually look like?
Okay, so for a name, the normal form is usually an identity statement, like name equals, and then some formula with exactly one free variable. And that formula has to, meet certain conditions. Like, you have to be able to prove that at least one thing fits the description and at most one thing. For predicates, it's usually simpler. You just define the predicate applied to some variables as a formula with those same variables free. And for function symbols, it's similar to the case of names, where the function applied to its arguments is defined as some formula with those same arguments as free variables.
Okay, so there are like these templates for well-behaved definitions.
Yeah, you could think of it like that. And by sticking to these normal forms, you can usually avoid any logical weirdness.
They just work?
Yeah, they just work.
But the text also makes this point that the traditional account doesn't actually require definitions to be in normal form.
That's right. It's not like it's a hard and fast rule.
As long as a definition satisfies conservativeness and eliminability, it's good to go, logically speaking.
Yeah, those are the gold standards. And you can have definitions that are really complicated with complex structures in both the definendum and the definiens, and even definitions that look circular at first glance.
Really?
Yeah, like the way we define exponentiation in Peano arithmetic, those definitions, they're recursive, so they kind of refer back to themselves.
Yeah.
But you can often show that they're logically equivalent to definitions in normal form. So it's all about whether they ultimately pass the those two big tests, conservativeness and eliminability.
Okay, that makes sense. The bottom line is whether they do the job they're supposed to do.
Exactly.
All right, let's get to conditional definitions now. This is where the definition only applies if certain conditions are met.
Right, like a first cousin once removed. That only makes sense if we're talking about humans, and you can
Yeah.
only divide by a number if it's not zero.
Right, right.
And these kinds of definitions, they can be a bit tricky when it comes to eliminability.
Oh yeah, why is that?
Well, as the conditions aren't met, it seems like you can't always replace the defined term with the definition.
So like what's the first cousin once removed of the number 7?
Right. Or what happens when you divide by zero? The definition just doesn't give you an answer.
Okay, so how do philosophers deal with that?
Well, there are two main ways. One is to kind of restrict the language itself.
Okay.
So the idea is that the definition, it's implicitly saying, okay, this term only applies to these kinds of things. So if you try to use it outside of that, well, you're just talking nonsense.
So it's like it's not even grammatically correct to ask about the first cousin once removed of a number.
Right.
Okay, and what's the other way?
The other way is to just stipulate what happens in those weird cases. Like we could just say division by zero equals zero.
Just make something up.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can always eliminate the defined term.
But doesn't that kind of create more problems? Like now you have these sentences that are technically true, but they don't really mean anything.
Yeah, that's the downside. You have to be really careful about how you're interpreting things when you do that.
So each approach has its pluses and minuses.
For sure.
All right, let's move on to implicit definitions now.
Yeah.
This is where a term is defined not directly, but through a set of axioms or a whole theory.